Welcome to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. I'm your host, Shannon Ables, and whether you're listening on your commute, exercising, working in the garden, or sitting down with a hot cup of tea or a café au lait, thank you for tuning in. Let's get started. Welcome to the 35th episode of the SImple Sophisticate. Today's episode is inspired by Kate Bolick's recently released book, Spinster, Making a Life of One's Own. It was just released on April 21st, and having had the opportunity to have an advanced copy, I have been diving into this book, annotating like crazy, and trying to make sense of how exactly I want to approach it in my review with you, the listeners, and the readers on the blog. Now, I was first introduced to Kate Bolick when she wrote an article for The Atlantic in 2011 called All the Single Ladies. It immediately caught my attention. This idea that, wow, women are successfully living on their own. Why are we still under this impression or this some sort of social stigma that we must at some point in our lives get married? Why? Why is it there for women and not for men? And it was very interesting how she attacked it. And I'll actually provide a link to that article in today's show notes, podcast 35. But I decided to look at it the way she intended, I feel, because if you look at the subtitle, it's Making a Life of One's Own. So today's episode is called 3 Ways to Design a Life that Works Best for You. So let's get started. I want to begin with a quote from the book. Here we go. Certainly, the single woman was reviled in the 1950s in the way all minorities are stigmatized to ratify the choices of the majority. End quote. Married or single, there tends to be a battle of defending either one side or the other, attempting to prove that one is better than the other. Perhaps it's maybe the competitive nature of human beings who feel that they must prove themselves or prove that the decision that they've made is right, that is acceptable. Because I find that often when people are so vocally adamant about a decision and they are arguing for it, it's often those people that are trying to convince themselves of the decision they've made. Ironically, undoubtedly, but more often this is a reflection that one has followed a path not because it aligned with who they were and what they were passionate about, but rather because they felt it was what they had to do due to social dictates. And in some ways, making such a decision that aligns with the majority of the populace does provoke some type of a euphoria, but it's usually a euphoria more out of relief than anything else. And I think this shouldn't be this battle, is single better than married, because is married better than single, because that's not the issue that she's trying to make here. And I don't think that should be the issue that we're trying to make when we sit down and have a conversation with someone. The issue should be, is this the life you want? Is this the life that fits who you are? That's the question we should be asking and thus answering. Whenever I think about that phrase, societal dictates, I remind myself that I am part of the society. We are all part of society. In other words, if we're not comfortable with the societal dictates or nudges or expectations, we can wield our influence by doing the opposite or something different. It does take courage, but every society over time, as we know, has refrained from being stagnant. Change is inevitable. I guess the biggest question then is, what type of change or shift do we want to see? So I have already seen some fantastic reviews and conversations on the radio as well with Kate Bolick about her book. And I think it's very interesting. And this kind of proves my point as to she's not saying that single life is the best life. She's saying that why can't it be accepted as an amazing life, just as being married supposedly is the best life. And we'll talk about that too. Don't worry as we get into the discussion. In fact, she actually is dating someone right now. And the question came up on a recent interview with NPR as to, okay, well, where's the relationship going? Do you think this is someone you may marry? And she stumbled. She's like, whoa, I don't like answering that question. And it's almost like it would have been easier for her to have been single when this book came out, but she's living her truth. She's doing what was introduced to her and comes naturally, what felt right for her. And I think that should be an instruction for all of us. Do what's right for you based on what is innately within you. Listen to yourself. Listen to yourself. So initially, with regards to the book, when I received the copy, initially I bristled at this choice of title. Spinster? Really? Why keep this negative term alive? Because it is. And it's unfair. But why give these ignorant bullies more ammunition? But then I started to read the book. And Bolick points out that the term spinster originated in the 15th century Europe, quote, as an honorable way to describe the girl, most of them unmarried, who spun thread for a living, one of very few respectable professions that were available to women at that time. Okay, I appreciate that research. I appreciate that information. Do we ever hear that when that word comes up? We don't. We just assume because of how it's used that it must be negative. So it's amazing how society or culture can take a word and use it for their own ammunition if the receiver doesn't have the facts of the actual history of the word. So I think that's brilliant on her part. This is when the word shifts. This is a little bit of a history lesson that she shares with the readers. When colonial America in the 1600s began, and it had its way with the term, think about the Puritans. And whatever you know about the Puritans, you probably no doubt remember the Salem witch trials. Yep. Over the course of the 17th century, the Puritans saw this increase of women not marrying. Approximately 20% were not marrying. And out of fear, but maybe frustration, because procreation was necessary to build their new population, and also with regards to the fact that unwed women were not allowed to have sex, or it was frowned on immensely not to have sex outside of marriage, these women were often accused of witchcraft because the Puritans felt as though they had lost control of too many young, fertile, most of them, women. They also then inflicted this name, the spinster, upon them, giving it its pejorative implication. I love it. Okay, I quickly began to realize why she had chosen the title. To re-educate society, to reclaim the term, and to shed light on the power of the masses when it's given disinformation. In the introduction, Bolick concludes with a simple statement that encapsulates this idea of, quote, making a life of one's own. She states, I built then my own kingdom according to my own laws, and when the sun beat down, it beat down only on me. And when my feet acclimated to the freezing water, it was my own resilience that made it so. End quote. Whether we choose to be single or choose to be married, the word I want to bring to your attention is choose. In the very first chapter, Bolick points out some awesome observations about modern day society, and she isn't wrong. The praise or guilt we feel based on the life choices we make to either marry, not marry, live alone, or refuse to settle until a partner is worth parting ways with our solitary blissful journey should only come from within us rather than outside of us. However, too often we live for that praise and run from the guilt or pressure that society inflicts, and we end up making choices that don't harmonize with our inner voice. Today, I'd like to share 3 insights that Bolick points out about choosing to be single or choosing to live the life of an unmarried woman. Along the way, I hope you will discover that it is when we take full responsibility of the wheel of our own lives that we will begin to charter our course along a path that will sit well with us, each one of us, regardless of onlookers' comments. All right, number one, the first way to design a life that works best for you is courage. So number one is courage is needed. Here's a quote from the book. I wasn't a woman who needed convincing that she wanted to be alone, but I did need help seeing clearly what that reality might look like, and evidence that there were indeed rewards to be gained if I was bold enough to pursue them, that, as Vivian Gortnick had put it, a world was waiting to welcome me if I was willing to enter it alone, end quote. Anytime anyone goes against the grain of what they've been conditioned to believe or against the crowd in any aspect of life, inner courage is without question required. But as Bolick points out, and as her career pinnacle this year is testament to, following the path that sings to you can offer great rewards and satisfaction. However, she makes an interesting point in her book with regards to the difference between men and women and the expectations in our society. And maybe this is why subconsciously, not all women, but some women, or maybe at times all of us at one point or another, are going to allow this expectation of marriage to permeate our lives. And if you have the book, I'm on page 68, and she starts off and she says, quote, "Who was I on my own? How could I possibly become an adult if I didn't know how to answer that? More important, how could I possibly be an adult if I didn't know how to take care of myself?" It was a perfectly reasonable question, relevant to just about anyone. It had nothing to do with gender, and yet it had everything to do with gender, because the question concealed an uncomfortable truth. As a woman, I wasn't required to take care of myself, ever. Here in the year 2000, the future itself, men were still expected to be breadwinners and providers no matter how hot my ambitions burned. I always knew, deep down, that if I couldn't make it as a writer, and if I failed to find my way in the working world, I could create personal meaning and social validation through getting married and having children. I had an escape hatch. Men didn't. Only now did I see the implications of this double standard. To be genuinely independent, I had to be both emotionally and financially self-sufficient. Truly so, prepared to not merely split bills with a boyfriend, but weather any potential future disasters on my own. End quote. As soon as I read this page, I was highlighting, I was marking it. I even shared it on Instagram, there'll be a link on my show notes today. But she makes a good point. This stereotype or this labeling that women should marry does provide a bit of a buffer. It takes away a bit of the angst. If all circumstances go according to plan and the husband does have a job and, the economy is going well, granted, there's all sorts of variables, right? But there is something to be said for having to be self-sufficient. It is stressful at times. It is anxiety-ridden at times when you're unsure if you can get the job you want, or you're unsure if you're able to make enough money or hold on to a job that you have during tough times. It takes a lot of courage, not only to choose this life, but to do it well and to keep everything intact and to handle those ups and downs. It's not easy. But why not make it an equal avenue for both men and women? This is an opportunity for men just as it is an opportunity for women, but we need to understand the responsibility we're taking on. And even if we wish to shun and run away from it, hey, it is scary. We actually are doing ourselves a disservice. We are actually doing ourselves a disservice. Anything worth attaining is going to be difficult. It's going to take time. It's going to take discipline. And this is one of those instances. So number one, courage. Courage is needed to design the life that works for you. Number two, just because society says so doesn't mean it is so. If the image of a 1950s happy family runs around in anyone's mind as the ideal, they're missing the big picture. With such a parochial perspective, our modern society tends, as Bolick reminds, to only reflect back 60 years and then stop. While the majority of American women were married in 1960, in fact, 83%, this wasn't always the case. That was the high point. The high point being the highest amount of women that were married in one particular time era. In fact, in 2012, 52% of women are single. The second highest point, get this, 1890. In 1890, 34% of women were unmarried. But for some reason, many either are ignorant of this fact or choose to ignore it. Bolick attributes short-sightedness to a theory that humans lack the imagination to see further into the past than 2 generations removed, because they typically didn't know anyone who lived in that generation. And while this may be true, it is handicapping. It is unfair. It unfairly defines a woman's role, and for that matter, a man's role in society and what they're capable of contributing to society. So number 2, just because that may seem like the ideal for some people doesn't mean it should be the only way. Everyone has their own definition. Pursue what is something you're comfortable with, what sits well with you based on who you are. Along those lines, number 3, heed what speaks to you. Here's a quote from the book. As a possible self, Maeve Brennan embodied my longings for an independent self, a writer's self, an elegant self, end quote. To assume that all women wish to be single would be an ignorant assumption, just as the previous assumptions have proven to be wrong as well. However, whatever your yearnings are, don't shush them. Examine them. Where do they originate from? Your upbringing, your religious doctrine, the media that surrounds you, or is it coming from you innately? It takes time to discern the difference. If you quickly answer and have never done examinations, check again. I really do. I encourage you to go a little deeper. It's easy to say it's because generally what I want, if that is what society applauds. But really do, at least examine it. Do yourself a favor and at least examine it. You may come out with the same conclusion, but at least you truly know that it is you at the helm, not someone or something else. I can remember fondly as a child enjoying my own company, writing and reading insatiably. I also really enjoyed boys' company because there wasn't a lot of drama and they were just friends. And this became frustrating though as I grew older because many, but not all, of the men, our young men I met, wanted a quote wife. They didn't want necessarily me for who I was because that takes time. And as we know with anything, it takes time to get to know someone, and no one seemed to be willing to just get to know me. And that became frustrating when I was younger, absolutely frustrating. Perhaps you, like me, are not choosing a single life or a married life, but rather a contented, fulfilling life. And to compromise by cementing your decision either way would be ludicrous. After all, we can't know who or what opportunity is around the corner. And we don't know how any of those opportunities will affect us, but we can choose to live authentically. We can choose to examine our thoughts, take the time to get to know ourselves, and have a mind, therefore a life of our own. Now this book by Kate Bolick is in many ways a memoir. There's 2 parts to it. There's a memoir of her journey, of where she is now and how she got there, but she also follows the journeys of 5 women in history who, at times, some of them were married, but there were times that many of them were not, and some never married. But I think it's a wonderful pairing, I guess you could say, of historical figures along with the author's passion for this topic. And you may not agree with everything she does in the book, but we all have our journey to take, and I really applaud her for the courage to share that with us. I think many of us assume perfection has to be done in order to live well, and that's absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. We all must follow our own journey and live our own truth. We will suffer consequences from any actions that for whatever reason are wrong or wrong others. But then again, that's also subjective. And I think it's just very important, and she really seems to exhibit this, that we take the time to understand why we do what we do, understand why we're in certain relationships and why we're not comfortable in certain relationships, and understand why we're uncomfortable with our own company, because we're always going to be with ourselves. We're always going to be with ourselves. Her journey is beautiful. I encourage you to read it. Her writing is magnificent. She has a beautiful way with words. So I highly recommend you pick this book up. To conclude, No matter which path we travel or forge, as it may seem at times, we are the only one making that life choice that we have come to realize is the best direction for our lives compared to our inner circle. There is an amazing benefit in doing so. To refer back to one of Bolick's quotes in her introduction, I built my own kingdom according to my own laws. An inner strength begins to build when you choose to forge your own path. And even though we will run up against obstacles as we go along this journey, when we finally master how to navigate around them, we will boost our self-confidence. And when we achieve the goals we have worked so hard for, we will bask in that sunshine that she speaks about, knowing that we are indeed capable of what some may have said was impossible. Don't be limited. Shine brightly, and work. Be willing to work very hard. Do the homework. Get to know yourself. Get to know life. Get to know what it all means, because there's always going to be questions that can be answered. Always. The key is to be the designer of your one and only life. You will thank yourself. The life events that will unfold will be your reward. Savor them. You will have earned them, I promise. If you want any of today's show notes, you can find them on the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com/podcast35. And I'll also provide a link to her book so you can read more about it. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. I have a really brief Petit Plaisir that I think you're going to love. It's for those moments of tranquility and relaxation that we all need to take from time to time on a regular basis. I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll see you on the other side to talk about it. This week's Petit Plaisir is one that I mention here and there quite often on this podcast, and I actually included it, a mention of it anyway, in podcast episode number 28, A Modern Woman's Lifestyle Grocery List. And this one is L'Occitane's Lavender Foaming Bath. In other words, a lavender bubble bath. And there's something about the scent, first of all, that just helps to relax you. But it's also a luxury to be able at the end of a busy day or the end of a weekend that you thoroughly loved, but you're exhausted and you're trying to unwind and transition into prep mode for the next week ahead. I love starting off a bubble bath with the lights dim, a candle lit, either my iPad playing a movie or music playing, and if I'm in the mood, a glass of wine or a truffle. There's just something so simple and so absolutely lovely and decadent about such moments, and it doesn't cost that much. This is definitely a luxury purchase, but it will last a long time. All you need is about 1 or 2 tablespoons, and you're golden. I highly recommend L'Occitane Lavender Foaming Bath for your next and regular me time. I hope you've enjoyed this week's Petit Plaisir, where each week ideas are shared to make the everyday all the more enjoyable. Tune in at the end of each Monday's podcast where I'll recommend a book, a film, or a recipe. Anything that is a simple pleasure to satiate your sophisticated taste. Thank you for tuning in to the SImple Sophisticate podcast, where intelligent living is paired with signature style. For more ideas and inspiration throughout the week, stop by the blog, thesimplyluxuriouslife.com, or pick up the book, Choosing the Simply Luxurious Life, A Modern Woman's Guide. Until next Monday, I'm your host, Shannon Ables. Bonjour!